Hello everyone, sorry for the delay in production, but I had a daughter, and it's my first daughter, and that's been quite the adjustment in my life, as you can imagine. Let us speak about the fourth Gorean novel, Nomads of Gore. Often the heroes of sword and sorcery are depicted as mightily thewed men who can bend iron bars and wrestle bears. The Gore series has been criticized for depicting men's main virtue as being this physical power, and that this physical power will inevitably lead to moral corruption. A Gorean male has no problems taking a woman by force or murdering another man and taking his possessions for his own. Such critics focus upon this aspect of the Gorean fiction, but I feel they'd never read a novel such as Nomads of Gore, which I'm very close to and feel very attached to, because it's the first of the first five Gorean novels that made me laugh, sigh, and gasp in appreciation of the tactics used by the heroes and the depth of their character. And all of this begins in a singular scene in which the first value is expressed, that of appropriate force. The very first scene we see in Nomads of Gore, people are fleeing from the advance of the Tuchuks, and Tarl is walking towards them, and people think Tarl is mad. We'll get to that in a second. The exposition that causes this scene is where the mercy gets revealed. Now, mercy is present in all the Gorean tales, but it is seldom overt. For instance, back in Tarnsman of Gore, when Tarl tries to be merciful to a captive, his reward is that she attempts to assassinate him by pushing him off a flying tarn. Yet that betrayal is immediately followed by a scene of mercy, in which one of the spider people preserves Tarl's life. The virtue of mercy appears in Nomads of Gore at the beginning, with Tarl Cabot accepting a mission to find the missing egg of the Priest Kings, a mission he accepts at the tail end of the previous novel, Priest Kings of Gore. The future of the entire race of Priest Kings is contingent upon Tarl recovering this egg. And it shows a great deal of mercy in Tarl's character, because I remember what my reaction to the plight of the Priest Kings was. My gut reaction was simply, let the buggy bastards croak. And think about this. The Priest Kings are a race that have subjected all human lives on Gore to a life of barbarity, violence, and limited technology. They've abducted humans from Earth to now populate the planet of Gore, with the excuse of, hey, we know better than you, accept our enlightened tyranny. And they will murder anyone who discovers or invents technology the Priest Kings do not approve of, because they feel that technology may lead humanity down some morally erroneous path. The Priest Kings basically tell Tarl that they feel barbarism is humanity's most ideal state, not its natural state, not a state brought about by its current technology, but ideal. And yes, with the event of Misk's ascension to being the leader of the Priest Kings at the end of the third novel, there might be a change in this. But I want you to consider how many Priest Kings accepted Sarm's tyranny and fought for Sarm's vision of a subjugated humanity. Even under Misk's enlightened leadership, the Priest Kings refused to transfer humans back to Earth. Instead, they leave them in their state of barbarism upon Gore. Does that sound like an enlightened being to you? Misk and his enlightened Priest Kings could share their technology with the surface humans of Gore and convince them to live in a more civil society, such as the one Misk is building. In fact, in the Nesk, we see humans and the Priest Kings that are there making this kind of hybridized society. But they're not willing to extend that out. Instead, Misk is content to watch from afar and let the humans on the surface continue to murder, enslave, rape, and steal from one another, when he could in fact put a stop to it. I repeat, let the buggy bastards croak. But instead, Tarl chooses to aid them. He chooses to aid the species and the specific member that manipulated Tarl's life, abducted him from Earth, destroyed his home city, and scattered his Korriban people to the winds. That fictional Tarl Cabot has more mercy in him than I believe any real-world person would. And this is something that sets Tarl apart from the heroes of other sword and sorcery heroic fantasy, sword and planet, sword and sandals, etc. Whatever you want to call this kind of fiction. Conan the Barbarian would have lopped the heads off the Priest Kings and destroyed all their eggs with a hammer. Tarzan and Kigor would likely have demanded the Priest Kings go into seclusion forever and never emerge. Guthabal would simply use that big elephant axe to lop the heads. You get the idea. But in this novel, Norman is casting Tarl in the mold of Burroughs' John Carter, who in a similar station of captivity rises to prominence amongst his captors and ends up with friendships with them. Now in the Barsoom saga, this is settled more reasonably to me because the Tharks of Barsoom and the Red Men are more able and willing to enter into a peace agreement with Carter as the catalyst. Very much like any two warring nations in our real world often need a negotiator. But the Priest Kings of Gore are not in that position of relative equality to the humans of the planet. They are not simply another nation of the planet, they are the masters of the planet, able to control its motion and slay with impunity. Even after the War of the Nest is over, the culture that emerges amongst them that seems enlightened at first still has some troubling features. Even Misk's Priest Kings hold values and believe in ideas that I believe to be so troubling that they should be considered antagonistic to humanity. Flame death, the lethal punishment for breaking the Priest King's rules, does not seem to stop even after Misk takes over. At least that's what it seems to be from what I've noticed. Cabot may actually be foolishly merciful here, doing this for the Priest Kings. But nonetheless, the fact that he shows that mercy, and that Norman writes that into his hero, I feel speaks of Norman not endorsing barbarism as the male ethic, not endorsing retribution, but instead endorsing mercy. Now later in the work, when a woman from Earth is first caught by the Tuchuks, we'll see this mercy expressed again as Tarl attempts to minimize her suffering. To further support the idea that Norman may be critiquing the idea of pure barbarism and might makes right, fuck you, Ragnar Redbeard, I offer the illustration he gives of Tarl's insistence of only using appropriate force throughout Nomads of Gore. Now, what do I mean by appropriate force? Let us say that you're in a bar and someone insults you. Is it appropriate to haul back your fist and smash that bloke in the mouth? No. It is even less so to pick up a bottle and bash it over his head, even if he is a cretin. This is certainly what Conan the Barbarian would do, as written by Robert Howard. Yet when Tarl Cabot is confronted with 4 members of the Wagon Peoples, a nomadic group of warriors that seem to be patterned on the Huns, the Scythians, and the Mongols, he routinely declares his peaceful intentions. He continues to do so even after the Wagon Peoples attack him. Tarl refuses to slay his attackers. Instead, he defends himself by blocking blows with his shield, deflecting them with his spear, and his use of force only to defend himself accumulates in a feat of expert swordsmanship. One of the Wagon people throws a bola at Tarl, and Tarl cuts the bola in half in mid-flight, preventing himself from being captured or anyone else from being hurt. During this scene, the repeated declarations by Tarl of his peaceful intentions, his resolute adherence to his warrior case codes, and his use of only as much force as is needed to solve a problem, impresses the Wagon peoples who observe it. They then extend to Tarl the rare honor of being one of the first strangers they have not enslaved, nor will they slay. Not exactly a barbarian sword and sorcery fare, is it? Had this been a Conan story, the mighty Cimmerian would have cracked heads, slaughtered horses, broken spears, etc. The Phantom or the Shadow would have simply pulled the twin 45s and begun filling the air with lead. Once again, in Norman's description of Tarl Cabot's actions, I'm reminded of John Carter of Barsoom and his Victorian chivalry. The novel Nomads of Gore continues, and throughout it Tarl demonstrates these traits again. When the Wagon peoples bring Elizabeth, a girl that has been abducted from Earth, into their camp, Tarl speaks to her in English and attempts to ease her into the customs of Gore, at least to the degree that she will not commit some offense for which the Wagon peoples will slay or torture her. He tries to aid her in coming to terms with the Gorean rules of slavery and how most Goreans treat women. I know some detractors say that this is Tarl grooming Elizabeth, as they will end up together at the end of the novel. But an objective reading of this text shows that Tarl is actually remorseful for what the young woman's fate will be, and he knows there's no way to correct it. So instead, he attempts to arm Elizabeth with the knowledge she will need to survive. That may not seem like appropriate force, but what is the alternative? If Tarl tries to free her, he has to fight the entire Wagon peoples, jeopardizing his mission and probably getting them both killed. Not to mention, where on Gore will they run to where it's any different? Nowhere. Now we're going to speak more about Elizabeth later, but it will need to be a few videos from now when we treat some of the things from Assassin of Gore, Slave Girl of Gore, and Captive of Gore. Later in the novel, the city of Turia will fall to the Tuchuk invasion. Amidst the battle, Tarl notes the terror and lamentations of the women of Turia as they are captured and enslaved. Further, when the city is taken, it is revealed that the Tuchuk leader, Kamchak, will allow the city to remain rather than raze it to the ground, as was feared. The reader is given two audible reasons for Tuchuk's decision. The first is that Kamchak believes that the Wagon peoples, and the Tuchuks in particular, benefit from having an enemy. Having the city-state of Turia to rally against gives the various tribes, and one would imagine by extension their leader, a target to direct hostility that might otherwise be internalized amongst the tribes. And while it is tempting to also assign an economic reason to this decision, having a major trade spot remain there for the Wagon peoples to routinely migrate by, it is revealed to the reader that Kamchak's mother was from Turia, and as such he cannot bring himself to raze his mother's home city to the ground. Now, while this, I guess the best word would be nostalgia, doesn't pass as mercy in the modern ethic, that would be mercy according to the ethics of the Iron Age, where personal attachment to a person or a place might engender you to be more merciful than you normally would be. There are also scenes of the punishment the Tuchuks exact from their slaves that on the surface read horrifically, but if you pay careful attention to them, you can see the gentling hand of mercy and appropriate force at work. For instance, in the scene in which Elizabeth attempts to escape, knowing that to attempt so is normally a death sentence, Kamchak catches her. Now she offers a very flimsy and easily countered explanation about why she wasn't really running away but fetching water. Everyone sees through this. Rather than let her be ripped apart by wild animals, the normal punishment, Kamchak instead removes from her the privilege she had formerly possessed of being dressed in a rich skin and not being collared as the other slaves are. Kamchak then spends the rest of that chapter trying to convince Tarl to buy Elizabeth so that Kamchak will be able to give her to a master that he is convinced will not abuse her and will be able to take care of Elizabeth, someone who's familiar with her barbarian ways. Though to Tarl this seems like Kamchak being callous, Kamchak's actually trying to be kind within the moralities constraints that he has learned upon the plains. And only is this apparent if you take into account that Kamchak is using the minimum amount of force to get what he needs done. That is, namely, accomplish the goal of placing Elizabeth with a man that is good for her. There's a scene in which he has Elizabeth stripped for what would be whipping, for punishment, but rather than whip her, he merely takes the whip to perform what's called the caressing kiss, which basically reveals to the reader that Elizabeth has some submissive tendencies. Yeah, Norman had a BDSM fetish, what can we say? But when the scene starts, the reader is honestly convinced that Kamchak's going to whip the skin off this girl for running away. And he doesn't. Instead, he just shames her. And while that may seem cruel, within the morality that you have on Gore, that's actually a kindness. But often I hear critics miss these subtle depictions. It is very easy, and you'll probably hear me say this multiple times throughout this series about the wisdom of Gore, because of some of Norman's hang-ups, to tune out some of the subtle wisdom that's here. But Nomads, you see repeatedly that mercy is advantageous to human life, which is why it gets expressed. And that the appropriate use of force prevents more problems than you would otherwise have to deal with if you just went straight to tyrannically subjugating everyone to your will. Again, doesn't seem like very barbarian fare, does it? Doesn't seem like a Conan the Barbarian killing the monster, getting the loot, and leaving the girl high and dry after he bangs her. Doesn't seem like that at all. When we return to the two chooks in the next video, we'll be speaking about another virtue that Normandy uses them to express, that of being able to improvise and use your ingenuity.